The thesis for our topic is The Motives and Actions of Native American Boarding Schools Rejected the 14th Amendment, which states all Americans have equal rights, followed by the First Amendment, freedom of expression and religion, while also rejected the responsibility of respecting the beliefs and cultures of other citizens of our country. The Native American assimilation era began in 1819 when the U.S. Congress passed the Civilization Fund Act. This act influenced American education to be provided to indigenous groups and therefore forced the civilization process.
This led to the creation of federally funded Native American boarding schools. 357 boarding schools operated across the U.S. and housed over 60,000 Native children in this era. Indigenous children were forced to attend by the U.S. government, regardless of if the families gave consent.
The education focused on adjusting the children to American society. Male students were taught to do manual labor such as blacksmithing, shoemaking, and farming, while female students were taught to cook, clean, sew, do laundry, and care for farm animals.
Standard academic subjects such as reading, writing, math, history, and art were also taught, but these subjects emphasize American beliefs and values.
At these schools, Native students were neglected and faced many forms of abuse, including physical, sexual, cultural, and spiritual. We will now explain some perspectives of survivors. This survivor story is from the perspective of Matthew Ward Bonnet. His earliest memory was being separated from his family at just 6 years old. He'd been excited to go to school for the first time when his parents dropped him off at St. Francis in September of 1952. But that changed when he realized he wasn't going back home. I can't remember anything before the mission school, but I remember too much about the mission school, he stated. There is a priest monitoring the children, and if they cried, he says the priest beat them. He'd come out of that room and he'd pull the first kid out of his bed and start slapping him, he said. He was not allowed to see his sisters that were at the school in the girls' dorms, and was rarely allowed to see his parents. 7 days a week, they were forced to attend Catholic Mass. They were told they were rotten for being born Indians. A thick leather belt with metal grooves, a willow stick, and a braided rope, the children named the Jesus rope, were used to abuse him. He attempted to take his own life during summer break after completing the 8th grade. I was ashamed of who I was, he says, because I didn't know who I was.
The next perspective is from Denise Laggy-Mortier. She tells her parents' story of their experiences of being forced into a boarding school. The children were sent to these schools to be assimilated of their native cultures, languages, and spiritual practices. They were forced to learn English and often abused if they didn't follow the rules or speak in English. The rules that were set were so strict it was very hard for young kids to follow consistently. Mama was made to kneel on a broomstick for not speaking English, and was locked in closets for not speaking English. Denise said, they would pee their pants because they were in the closet for such a long time, and then the nuns would take them out of the closet and beat them. Papa was beaten with a belt. He saw one of his fellow students die from a beating at school. Denise's dad's friend wasn't the only student at the school to get killed. Being in a boarding school wasn't the only traumatic thing her parents had to go through. Her parents left these boarding schools and experienced alcoholism, anger issues, and problems with mental health and PTSD. Denise says, my mother started whispering about being sexually abused, and she said, I don't know why I'm telling you. I have not told anybody. Almost every survivor from this school experienced sexual abuse or they witnessed it.
The next perspective is from Anita Yellowhair. She is a Navajo woman and a boarding school survivor. She was 10 years old when she was forced to leave her home in 1950, wearing a dress and having 50 cents in her pocket. She was sent to Intermountain Indian School in Brigham City, Utah. Anita went through 10 years of schooling there. As a student, you were required to speak English, and she didn't even know what that was. Finally, I get to that point. I'm old now. What's the point? I still want to go back home. I never fully accepted the white man's way, but I still want to learn, Anita states. The trauma of her boarding school was never lost on her. She wishes she could go back to her culture. Most survivors, such as Anita, would never share their stories in depth because of how traumatic and life-changing it really was. So much mental and physical abuse occurred in hundreds of these schools.
This is Adeline Fox's story at a Native American boarding school. She remembers her grandpa dropping her off at the school bus to go to St. Labre Indian Mission School. He told her not to speak their Cheyenne language at the school, to speak only English, and he warned her that her hair was going to be cut. Our hair is very sacred culturally. Our hair is sacred. We do not cut our hair, but they can do that. When you get there, your blackbirds are not going to come home, remembered Fox. One time, she accidentally responded to a friend in a Cheyenne language instead of English. The nuns washed her mouth with fly soap. Federal Indian boarding school policies have impacted every Indigenous person I know. Some are survivors, some are descendants, but we all carry this painful legacy in our hearts, Fox said.
This perspective is about a survivor named Edith Young, who is a native of Alaska and now lives in Michigan. As a child, she was forced to leave her parents and live in an Indian boarding school in Seattle. Although she is 80 years old, the memories still hurt. We were yelled at and slapped. In 3rd grade, I asked the teacher why she was teaching that Columbus discovered America when Indians were there first. She came over and slapped me across my face to be humiliated in front of the class. I'll never forget that. The last of the Native American boarding schools closed in the 1990s. Another tragic consequence from these boarding schools are generations of Native American children were not raised by their own parents and never learned how to be loving parents themselves.
Ramona Klein, Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, North Dakota. At 7 years old, Ramona climbed aboard the bus in 1954. She didn't fully understand where she was going, but 100 miles from home, she arrived at the Fort Troughton Indian Boarding School. Her day had always started at 6 a.m. doing chores and manual labor. Most meals were small, such as burnt toast for breakfast and soup or mush for lunch and dinner. Ramona, to this day, gets flashbacks from the sound of keys on a chain. This is because he would steal his mother's keys and open the door into the girls' dorm and sexually assault her while she was supposed to be sleeping. No child should ever be touched in the way he touched me. Coming from Ramona herself, so many awful things happen to the children at these schools.
This is Donovan Archambault's perspective at the Pierre boarding school in South Dakota in the early 1950s. He said the schools tore his family apart. 2 of his sisters committed suicide, 3 in his family almost drank themselves to death, and 1 is a pedophile because of what the priest did to him. All I did was get beat up. They took a shoe and started hitting me. He made my nose bleed. He gave me a scar on my forehead. But I had to tell somebody, and when I did tell somebody, that's what my answer was. "That's our father. You don't talk about him like that," said an operator at the school. I never said another word about it, but the anger grew, Archambault stated. Native American boarding schools aim to erase the identity of Native American children. The schools resulted in deep trauma for the victims and a loss of culture. The history of these schools reflects how cruel and discriminative the United States used to be. The actions of these schools rejected the First and 14th Amendment and the U.S. responsibility of respecting others for the way they are. The purpose of this documentary was to acknowledge the extreme pain and trauma the victims of these schools experienced.